Good evening. I hope you've had a really good week and a wonderful day, and they're ready for the word tonight and to continue to look into the chapter 3 of Daniel.
We're so glad that you decided to join us tonight, either live or later in the recording. We are excited about the Bible study tonight in chapter 3 of Daniel. Another prophetic word, lots and lots to be discussed tonight, so we're not going to take too much time. There is one thing we want to remind you of that we're super excited about. What would
We're
that
super excited. We are excited about our comeback service that we're having May 31st, and we're going to be here at 10 a.m., our regular scheduled Sunday morning service. There won't be any worship service on Sunday night for a while till we kind of get through this COVID stuff. But at 9 o'clock in the morning on May 31st, our doors will open. We do recommend that you wear a mask, and please be patient with us with seating and stuff like that, because it's going to be a little bit different, not too much. Just trying to comply to the guidelines that are set before us. And we're going to have corporate prayer at 9:45. So make sure you come and come early, because we'd love to have you here. We've got a couple other surprises for you to kind of help the day be very rememberable. And we're just excited about this reunion of the saints.
Yes, we are. It's been way too long, and we are excited about getting people back together. And we just want you to continue to pray, invite folks. Maybe perhaps somebody that their church ain't open or whatever, or what something that's happened. Invite them. They can come be part of ours, and when their church doors open, they'll go back to their church. It's really okay. And that goes for anyone, if you want to come and be a part of the church. So
Yeah, because I think right now people are really looking for a place to call home.
It's church. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be your church. If you need a place to go and you have a church open right now, you're welcome here if you're watching this. So,
but if you are not feeling well,
please do not come.
And you're running a temperature.
That goes without saying. Our folks are very, very smart, and they know better than that. But we have been blessed. As far as I know, nobody in our church has been sick from this. So I thank God for that protection. And
if you're not comfortable with getting out just quite yet, that's okay. Just continue to watch us here. We're still going to be streaming on Facebook and YouTube, and we would love to have you to join us.
The only thing I would caution you about is the fact that allowing something like the media source like this become your norm. This is never intended to be the way things are. It's a source to get the word out. An evangelism tool primarily is why we do it. So if you're a member of this church or you belong to this church and you attend this church, we really need you in the seats. God needs your gifts here because everybody matters to the body of Christ.
Well, and there's just something to be said about coming together with your church family.
And we all know that. I don't need to say that, but at the same time, I feel like I need to, because that we need to come back together to worship as one.
They say it takes 21 days to form a new habit, and it's been well over that long.
We don't want the bad habits of not being in church to stick.
This is not your new normal.
No. You're new. You belong here with us.
That's right.
So let's get into the word tonight. Daniel chapter 3. I'll ask Jenny to read along there, and we'll discuss the word.
All right. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces, to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had made.
All right, so this statue was
Pretty impressive.
very arrogantly made by the hands of those that represented himself as an expression of greatness and of glory, and reflected the dream that he had of him having a head of gold.
And
It
it
said-
was pretty impressive.
It was pretty impressive. It said it was like the size of a normal sized tree, 90 feet or so high, 9 feet wide, a fairly large tree at that. So it
Yeah.
stood out. It had been very heavy because of all the gold,
and very shiny.
very shiny. And we've learned that, God is symbolically used, our gold is symbolically used of God. And so he has literally made himself into a false god.
And 9 feet wide. When you say that it's kind of like a tree, you're talking about the 90 feet
The 90
tall.
feet and, like the size of a,
And then 9 feet wide is, like we said, one of our church pews might
Yeah.
be
yeah.
a
pretty
9
close
foot
to that,
long pew. So it
yeah.
was
So pretty,
it was a
pretty
pretty
large,
good
yeah.
sized statue that he had made of himself. I wonder if like Bald Knob Cross would be something that could resemble,
I
or
don't
do you
know.
think that
I'm
might
not
be
sure
too big?
just exactly how tall that cross is, but I would venture to say it's probably taller than that.
You think so?
Yeah, I would say it's probably.
So you think this could be seen for a few miles
I
at
would
least?
say this, especially in this time frame, I'm sure it would have been seen from quite some.
for
Yeah.
quite a ways. Dura actually means circle or dwelling. So that means that this was still within the boundary of Babylon.
Right.
So they still stayed within the kingdom where
Right,
King Nebuchadnezzar
right, exactly.
was the ruler.
Exactly. Well, Nebuchadnezzar had recognized that the God of Daniel, he recognized the God of Daniel as being the greatest of all gods. Now, we find that in the last chapter, but see, he built false gods in the verses above. The problem we had is he believed and he understood of Daniel's God, but it didn't stop him from worshiping other gods. But he did recognize him. He did not recognize him as the only God. Was the biggest problem there.
So King Nebuchadnezzar had asked for all the local dignitaries to come out to be a part of this dedication ceremony.
Right. To be a part of it, everybody and anybody that wasn't anybody, they were invited to come over because Nebuchadnezzar wanted them to see it. He wanted to establish who he was proclaiming. Again, like I like to think when it comes to people like in the scriptures that weren't God-fearing or whatever, they only are doing what they know. They only are doing what they believe is right. And so Nebuchadnezzar was no different.
Right. His culture, they were used to having several gods. Like I know
Right.
that they
Pagan
had
gods,
like
yeah.
a fertility god and a sun god, and
Right.
they had different gods that they worshiped them all.
Right. It would be a lot like someone coming to you as a Christian saying, this God over here, he's the real God and your God is false. You would look at that person like they're crazy. Now, obviously, we know our God is, the only God for lots of different reasons. But at the same time, if you think about it, it would be just as messed up for someone to try to tell you there's only one true God if they believe there's multiple gods and they believe in their own right that, they've experienced or whatever. But God Jehovah, he stands out in such a way that they're not used to.
Yeah, and I think that it could be possible that King Nebuchadnezzar wanted to also be considered as a god.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that was the purpose in his statue. He wanted to symbolize him setting up as a god. Again, it all goes back to the dream. He takes it as, as what it was, and he wanted to become.
There were probably a lot of oohs and ahs that day.
Right. Yep. So
Okay, you want to go to verse 4?
let's do it.
Okay. Verse 4, then a herald cried aloud. Page. To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. So at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, harp, and lyre in symphony with all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up.
Okay, so remember the children of Israel when they worshiped the golden calf on the way to the promised land. They danced, they sang. The Bible speaks of rivalry, the rivalry going on. Music seems to accompany worship of God as well as any false god. So music prepares the heart to receive a message. Why is it so important then that we do worship before and during church?
I think that there's a couple reasons, and I believe for myself that worship connects the body of Christ. When we come together to worship, it's said over and over again, come together and assemble, and having unity in the body, it is a connection between the brothers and sisters of Christ, and helps us to soften our hearts.
Right.
So that we can receive the word and let the word penetrate us and change us.
Right, exactly. And when we come together and we worship, I need the worship just as much as anybody else does, and especially more so even lately with having to come to preach to a predominantly empty room, and that took a lot of worship and focus, because I had to depend on the Spirit of God to empower me to preach with anointing. And the only way I can do that is when I've had an opportunity to be in worship, because I've got to get in that right frame of mind and get in that right spirit focus. And that's what worship does to me. So the congregation prepares to receive the word through worship, but I prepare to give it through worship. It's just the way that God, he uses the shepherd of the house. So he's excited to be a part of that, because that when you do things the way the Bible says to do and it works, those are those little things that happen to prove to you that God really is telling you the truth.
And that's something else here. We see a command to worship with a consequence.
Right.
If you don't.
Yeah. And that's the thing. God doesn't make you worship him. You can choose not to. That's fine. He loves us enough to give us free choice and free will. And that's where it's different with the enemy. The enemy wants to, make you worship him because he desires that. God desires it, but he's not so arrogant that he's going to make you do it. So,
well, and the enemy doesn't deserve it, and God does.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Because of the reason that we worship is different than what they were doing here.
Right.
Because they were doing it based upon fear for their lives.
Yes.
They had a lot at stake.
Fear was the motivator here. It become the source of the control, but
they didn't have any kind of relationship with, most likely they didn't have a relationship with King Nebuchadnezzar. They were just being obedient to the command, and maybe even based upon the consequences that they were fearful
and
of.
If we're not careful, we'll do the exact same thing. We'll fear going to hell as our motivation to go to church and serve God, and that's not what it's about, folks. It's not about being saved. It's not fire insurance, as I've heard people say. It is a relationship. Christianity is meant to be a relationship with Jesus, not a religion. But we've made it a religion, and that's where the churches of yesterday and today that's still plagued with religion. They hurt the body of Christ because they are so wrapped up in themselves, and we try not to be so wrapped up in who we are that we can't see, someone that needs Jesus. And
I think that's
relationship.
where our relationship comes into play. We can't help but to worship
Right.
because
Right.
God is so good.
Well, God wants the heart of man. We hear in the Psalms where he talks about David, and he said David was a man after God's own heart. And so David desired to know God, to know his word. And David wasn't perfect. He made lots of mistakes, and we find that throughout Scripture. But God desires that, and he doesn't want a formality of worship, church. He wants a worshiper. He don't want you to do it out of obligation. He don't want you to do it out of a tradition. He don't want you to do it out of some preacher telling you to do it. He wants you to do it because that's your desire and hope that you can give him all of your worship, and it be unadulterated. It's going to be of the heart. It's going to be not manipulated. It's going to be something
Right.
you choose to do. But the enemy here, Nebuchadnezzar, shows an example of how that he wants to force it. So,
And I think that if you don't have a desire to worship, you might want to check yourself and gauge where you're at spiritually,
right.
and something's not okay.
Right. You got to figure out, the Bible talks about doing your first works over again. That's probably where you need to start. So,
All right. Verse 8.
all right, do it.
Therefore at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery in symphony with all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. Is that a good stopping spot?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we believe here and see that perhaps there was some jealousy going on. Daniel and the three Hebrew boys, they had been raised in such a high position in the kingdom that these Chaldeans were carefully watching to find anything they might accuse them of. They were trying they were jealous of who they were.
Well, and maybe it's possible that the position that these guys and Daniel were put in were positions that the Chaldeans were looking forward to getting promoted to.
Yeah, perhaps.
I mean, maybe their promotion got stolen from them and they're bitter.
Well, they were, boys of the region. The Babylonians had, taken captive.
Yeah, that was their stomping ground.
And so they wanted to bring him in. The king wanted to bring him in to maybe to, he changed their names to Babylonian names, and he wanted to make them, I guess it could have been somewhat of an experiment, but he wanted the right people, smart ones, the good-looking ones, and, God had Daniel right in the right place. So anyway.
Yeah, I think that they were jealous, and they were definitely bitter because of the position was being filled by somebody that's in a different culture.
Right.
Among other reasons.
Now, the king did not really need to be reminded of the decree. It was possibly mentioned to him to tell him that there's no way out of punishing these Jews.
Maybe
like
King,
a reminder of this is what you put out, king, so you need to enforce it.
Maybe King Nebuchadnezzar was forgetful.
Well, I mean, there's always a possibility. That's
but probably
the nature
not.
of some, but most likely it was just a reminder, kind of a smart aleck kind of response, reminding him, hey, you did this, so now you need to enforce it.
Maybe they didn't believe that King Nebuchadnezzar would punish Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Well, maybe
because of their position.
Right, and that's very possible. They may have thought that because of who they were, would protect them from ultimate punishment, and that's very true. But the accusers was trying to say that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not honoring Nebuchadnezzar or his image. They were pretending to be for Babylon and the king, and they were not loyal to him. That's what they were trying to portray. And that's just not simply the way it worked.
Well, so you have these boys that are in a high position they're pretty much basically disobeying the rule. It's like a mom or dad giving rules to their kids and then letting one not follow them but expecting everybody else to. So I can see where there's a conflict of interest here with them not bowing down.
Right. I think that their jealousy was showing. First, we know that because they called them Jews, even though they used their Babylonian names, they called them Jews, and so this was kind of an indication that the king that they wanted the king to believe that they were faithful to Jerusalem and not to him. Trying again to catch him in some sort of disobedient act is what they were trying to do. Which, I mean, that's just the way it works. You know, people trying to bring you down, they're going to find whatever they can, and they're going to make it sound whatever way they can, and they're going to try to bring you down with that.
And they just didn't want Nebuchadnezzar to forget where they came from.
Right. Well, you know, they didn't regard, the accusers' accusations. You know, they didn't regard Nebuchadnezzar. They didn't worship his gods, they said. And then thirdly, they didn't bow down, and that was what got them in trouble. The enemy is always going to try to hit you where he knows you're not going to compromise. He's not going to waste his time trying to tempt you with something that you have no trouble with. He's going to tempt you with something that you simply cannot bring yourself to doing. And that's what had happened here.
Yeah, and I think worship is one of those places where if we're not intentionally worshiping God, then something is going to fill that void.
You're going to worship something.
I mean, we're created to worship.
You're going to worship something, either God or whatever. Whatever takes your time, takes your talents, takes your treasure. The majority of the time is going to end up being what you spend your time worshiping. Whether you like it or not, that's just the way it is.
What consumes you.
What consumes you most oftentimes will be what you worship. But anything you see is going to be a false god. Only one true God is unseen.
All right, ready to read some more?
Yep, let's do it.
Okay. And then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery in symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?"
Okay.
All right.
So it's interesting here, we find the rage and the fury, but it's interesting here to note that they did not accuse Daniel as being part of the refusal to worship witnessed by the Chaldeans. If Daniel had been present, he surely would have joined these others in faithfulness to God.
Which I'm sure that Daniel would have been present somewhere, because all of the important people of the land were here.
You kind of wonder why he wasn't pulled into this.
So, where's Daniel at in this picture?
Right. Maybe, possibly, perhaps, they were afraid Daniel had already proven himself. Maybe the purpose here wasn't the fact that he wasn't there, but maybe they was afraid that Daniel had proven himself, with interpreting the dream and that if they spoke up, then it could personally bring guilt upon them. So I think they were playing the safe card here. I think they were trying to make sure that
Yeah.
they didn't do something stupid.
Well, and then you
Because they was able to get majority. All they wanted to do is kill off the boys. They
Yeah.
didn't care about the.
well, and King Nebuchadnezzar only called for the accused. He didn't tag Daniel within that. So, but he had to have known that
Right.
if they didn't bow, then Daniel didn't bow. And there is a possibility that King Nebuchadnezzar seen it, knew about it, and was hoping that it would just,
Right.
go away and nobody would take notice that the boys didn't bow. So that's possible. Because, he was a smart enough king. I'm sure he had his eyes and ears open to everybody that was taking notice of his statue that he had made. And I don't think he would have missed seeing those boys hadn't bowed. So that may be
Right.
part of his anger there.
Yeah. So we see the progression here.
The second chance.
The second chance.
Second chance.
The second question. Hey, here's your second chance to do what I've told everybody else to do. So do it.
Yeah.
Well, they had made their mind up that they weren't going to do it. They didn't have to think about nothing.
Right.
It
And
was all decided upon.
he even reminded them about the fiery furnace, like that would make a difference.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that these the accusers were still around and in the room. They're looking forward to this. They're enjoying this.
Yeah. So, Nebuchadnezzar had called God, the God of gods. But
Back when the dream was interpreted is when he called, was when he said that.
yeah, what's important to note here is that he interprets God of gods as Daniel's God, but he doesn't let go of there still being other gods. Just because someone has knowledge of God does not mean they won't let go of the other gods they've been serving all this time, because it's what they're used
Yeah,
to.
that is what they're used to.
Right.
All right. You ready to go to 16?
Yep.
Okay. In verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up.
And there you have it.
Yeah.
They make a proclamation, a statement, and decision. They are just not going to do it. It's simply said. They don't need to think about it. They've already made up their mind. They've given their immediate answer. You just got to decide whom you're going to serve.
Yeah, and they were very respectful.
Right.
They still referred to him as king, and they didn't disrespect the king. They just were not willing to follow his orders because it compromised what they believed.
Compromised what they believed. They weren't willing to compromise what they believed in. They were not afraid of the fiery furnace or of Nebuchadnezzar. They just weren't moved. They weren't allowing fear to motivate them. They knew God was their present help in a time of need. They were not speaking as in arrogant manner to the king. They weren't doing something disrespectful. Once again, they were just standing their ground, which exactly what we should do. But this is the type of faith we need.
And this was a choice.
It was a choice.
They had worked on their faith. They've already been through the meal change. They had to stand up for that, and then with the dream, their lives were at stake with that. and here they are again, their worship is being challenged, and they have to just keep their faith, stay strong, and stand up for what they believe in.
Right. They basically are making a statement, if it means, we have to burn, we'll follow God into the fire. We're going to serve God and no other. That was their proclamation. We're not going to worship things made with human hands. We're going to make a full-on decision to worship the one true God, and that is our obligation as Christians, is to make that statement.
Yeah, we have to make a decision of who we're going to serve, because our God is a jealous God, and he's not going to be okay with us setting him next to another God in our life. We've got to have just him.
Him or none.
And that, I think, if you have more than one God and God is one of your gods, that's not possible for one.
God
but I
won't
think
maintain that relationship much longer.
But I think that's something that you could place like a mediocre Christian in, if you can even call it that.
Yeah. Well, a new Christian is not going to understand, and God's got patience and grace for stuff like that. But,
well, a new Christian's different than a mediocre Christian.
Well, yeah.
A mediocre Christian is a Christian that knows better but won't do it in some way.
Yeah, okay. Joshua 24:15 says, and if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, Joshua said, we'll serve the Lord. And that's the proclamation that we've got to make today.
All right, you ready for the next section of verses? All right. Then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their trousers, their turbans, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace.
So the normal amount of fire would have burned up anyone up who was thrown into it, but his anger caused him to make it 7 times hotter than usual.
Do you think there's a coincidence that he chose 7 times instead of any other number?
I think 7, as we learn, is the number of perfection. I think that this is not necessarily about a temperature, but it's about a completion. God is not afraid of fire. He is a consuming fire. But there is something to be said about the intensity of this heat that sometimes I think part of what's happening here is, it's often that we're brought into the intensity of the fire, intensity of the heat in the midst of the moment, and that's where God chooses to bring us to perfection. He's going to perfect us in the fire. That's how precious metals are purified, is in the fire. I think that we are found to be just exactly the same as that.
Okay, and I think that there is a possibility here that the situation was already impossible, but with it being 7 times hotter, it was completely impossible.
There was
and I
no
think
gap for,
exactly, and that's proven because the men that were putting them into the furnace, they died doing so.
Right, yeah.
So it's just a completely impossible situation.
And there was something up with this too. It was almost like they was afraid that something would happen, they would get loose.
And I wonder if maybe because these boys were never violent or, they haven't done anything to cause the king Nebuchadnezzar to have them bound. and the mighty men of valor, his mighty men of valor, were called to handle these boys. So it's almost like all of a sudden they are dangerous or a risk of some sort. But maybe because King Nebuchadnezzar is unfamiliar with their God, he was more afraid of their God, and so he was doing all he could humanly possible to stop their God.
Right. And I think the men, honestly, too, it was a possibility that they had to get the bravest warriors to get close to the fire.
That's a good point.
And so, it wasn't going to happen by just anybody. They knew what was going on. They knew if they went to the point to put the Hebrew boys in, that they were probably not going to make it out alive.
Wow. That's just as scary.
So, where you at?
I read 2:21. So we're ready to go.
Okay, verse 22.
Okay. So therefore, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, "Did we not cast three men bound into the midst of the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." "Look," he answered, "I see four men loosed, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the fourth is like the Son of God."
Okay, so it's been said that some ancient kilns were found to have been shaped like a vertical tunnel, open only at the top with a dome supporting the columns. And that would have made a lot of sense if you think about it, how they would have threw them in. They would have basically threw them in, but they would have been so close that the funnel effect of that fire would have burned them up. Now, if you think about that, I know they didn't burn up in the fire, but they still felt the heat.
Well, and you would think that if they had a form or fashion or way to put wood in the fire or charcoal in the fire.
Yeah, I think it said it was charcoal was most likely.
Okay. So
used.
they had to have a way to do that to keep the fire going. So I don't know, if it was like a chute or something that dispensed it. They could have put these men in that same way. Possibly somebody could have had a better idea than to using man force to put them in.
You would think that would have been a better option.
Because it's just too hot. Like when we go to a bonfire, if it's a big fire, sometimes standing back 5 feet, you can still feel the heat, and it's enough that you don't want to get any closer. Yeah. So it's kind of, why didn't they have a better plan to save those guys? But it's okay. King Nebuchadnezzar can do whatever he wants.
Yeah, in this text he did. A fire this hot would have, ordinarily burned up, someone in just a matter of seconds. But notice they were in the middle of the fire. God brings us to, like Noah, he saved him from the flood, out of the flood, not from the flood.
Right.
And Joshua and Joshua, saved. God saved Joshua in Egypt.
Joseph.
I'm seeing a J and I'm getting mixed up.
Joseph.
God saved Joseph. Look, get that right. From in Egypt, not from Egypt. God saved Joseph in the famine, not from the famine. God oftentimes allows us to go into the midst of the trouble before he shows up.
But I think it's interesting, you said that they definitely would have felt that heat, felt the warmth, but I don't know that they would have been, like when you get too hot, you get kind of sweaty. I don't think that they would have had that kind of effect, but it was just enough for them to know that it was real.
Right. It wasn't just a dream.
Because sometimes, when you have spiritual experiences or God protects you from something, you're like, okay, did that
really happen?
Did that really happen?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they were praying, weren't they? They were kneeling. They fell down bound into the midst of the burning fire.
Yeah.
And then I think at some point that, they became untied, and that's probably when they got up and started walking around.
Right. Because, at this point is when God covered them, protected them, something of this magnitude would have caught the eye of Nebuchadnezzar. Said, some earlier versions of Scripture, they've say that they were singing in the midst of the fire. Mm-hmm. I don't know about you, but if I was thrown into a pit of fire and I knew I was surrounded by fire and I looked at myself and I was alive and wasn't burning, I'd be praising too. So that would be my first reaction is, okay, I'm all right.
Well, the topic at hand is worship for them. So
Exactly.
It would make sense for them to be in this situation, in their worst situation possible, but they are worshiping their God.
Yeah, yeah. Well, God, God's He is in an ever-present place with us. For those who worship Him, that love Him, He's an ever-present place of need if we just trust in Him. This fourth person in the fire was the Son of God.
It's interesting that that's who King Nebuchadnezzar guessed it to be.
Yeah.
I think he was expecting God to show up.
You know what? That's very possible. He had been told that this was going to, God would, if He didn't save him from it, He would, be with him. And, and so that's very possible. Isaiah 43:2 tells us that when thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee. When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle up upon thee. God is a consuming fire. So fire is not a surprise to God. It's nothing to God. But they put their faith in the Lord, and He did not fail them in a time of need. Isn't that something?
He was there. He was with them when they didn't bow. He was with them when they got cast into the fire.
He was with them all the way. Mm-hmm. He didn't leave them, and much less forsake them.
Well, and He knew the fiery furnace was coming, and like many times we go through trials, God allowed it to happen. Right. He was with them through it, but God still allowed it to happen.
Right. Well, God's divine presence is with us when we go through troubles. Key on go through. God allows us to endure much in this lifetime, and it's not because God doesn't care. It's not because he gets some sort of pleasure from watching you squirm. It's that sometimes God allows the bad things to happen to you so that you can get the bad things out of you. Sometimes it's allowing God to work something out of you that He needs for you to work on.
A growing process.
A growing process, because there's nothing like going through pain to show you who you really are. If you never go through anything, how much can you ever go through? How much faith do you have if you've never been tested?
And there is that stretching too.
It's stretching. Stretching hurts. Nobody likes it. No one wants to go through any kind of stretching. But the fact of the matter is that God will allow us to go through troubles, and sometimes He delivers us out of the troubles. But sometimes He just walks through the troubles with us until we get to the other side. But God promises us that He'll protect us in times of trouble.
And I think one of the neat things about this is that Nebuchadnezzar needs a God experience. And God is using the Hebrew children to
display.
Yeah. And I think
power.
Sometimes God is using our lives to display His ability to other people that maybe don't know him. And I've talked to people where they've been through really terrible things, but they'll say, but then when it was over, so and so came up to me and said, I was watching you and I was just so sure you were going to give up, but you didn't give up. And God receives the glory on
Right.
both sides for that. People are watching us, and we have to be careful that we don't fail and we keep the faith and stay strong even though it's hot.
Yep. Well, there was a lot to be gained by this, the three Hebrew children going through, more faith for them, but also a world looking on, seeing how they would handle the problem. Like Jenny just said, they were watching to see just exactly how they would walk in or be thrown in the fire. What would they do? They proclaimed certain things, but what would happen? I would say that they were not the first people that thrown into the fire, much less first people that people witnessed thrown in the fire. This had happened before, and so they were witnessing something here. And as we know, they were not burned up, and God showed up and delivered them out of the fire. But what a testimony of the power of Jehovah.
And I would say they had their brave faces on, even though maybe on the inside they were unsure of how this was going to work out. But I'm sure that, they were not crying. They were just maybe thankful that God chose them to be
Right.
their faithful servants.
Well, the king recognizes their God. How could you deny that this God existed, because you've seen a display of the power in a supernatural way? He recognizes they're in good standing with God. But Nebuchadnezzar will have great respect for them, but Nebuchadnezzar, he's not going to serve them, okay? Not going to serve God in the same way, because, again, remember, he has been accustomed to serving more than one God, and that's not unnormal. For the Christian, the born-again believer in Christianity, we think of that as being nonsense, because we've been raised to believe that we serve one God and one God only. At least we do the best we can. However, Nebuchadnezzar was not raised to be like that, so he's seen them as men of great faith, but not exclusively just to one God.
Maybe he's still hopeful that there's more than one God as an option.
Right.
Maybe. You ready for the next bit?
Yep, let's do it.
Okay, then Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace. I'm sure he didn't get as close as the...
Yeah, I'm sure he didn't. He probably got close enough to feel the flames to make sure that
Yep.
it was real.
He went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke, saying, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire, and the satraps, administrators, governors, and the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them.
So we find here that God enacts a miracle.
Yes.
He supernaturally controls all the details so that his power is unmistakable. What an eye-opener for the onlookers.
Yeah.
They are going to see the God of the three Hebrew boys at work. And they've witnessed something tremendous. They would not have seen something like this ever before.
Yeah, and I think that it's quite possible, a roaring, blazing fire sometimes can be loud. So it is interesting that they were able to hear the king hollering for them from, near the mouth of the fiery furnace. And they were able to walk right on out.
Right. God protected them, and I think, again, this was used to be a display of the power of God. But again, we're not seeing Nebuchadnezzar really change too much. He's recognizing that, God, Jehovah, he protected them, and they had no smell of smoke on them. He calls them out, and they didn't even smell like smoke. It's one thing not to get burnt, but it's a whole other situation not to smell like the fire.
Yeah, and they still had their eyebrows.
Right.
It's really interesting. I wish that there was a story wrote by these boys about their experience.
Yeah.
That would be really interesting to...
it was as if God had them in a fireproof capsule. They
or
dropped
like a
in
bubble.
there like a bubble, they put them in a fireproof safe. And
they were in Jesus's personal space,
he was,
so they were untouchable.
Jesus, he covered them with his robe, and nothing can harm him. It's a really good example and display of how God really does love his children. He may let us walk into the fire, but he's not going to let us walk in alone. And when we get there, he's going to cover us with his grace and mercy. He's going to protect us. But though we are slain, we still are in his presence. Nothing can separate us except for you. You can separate yourself if you choose to, but nothing in this natural world can separate you from God. Only you.
I think that kind of goes back to the relationship status that we were talking about, having a relationship with God, and that's where that covering is at.
It's all about relationship. It's not about a religion. It's not about coming together for a religion. It's about coming together for a relationship, and that's something we've got to seek after in this day of the church age, because we've got to have a relationship with Christ.
Okay, so verse 27, and the satraps, administrators, everybody was there. Governors and the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw these men on whose body the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of smoke was not on them. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon.
Yep. Nebuchadnezzar here recognizes their God as being a helper. He showed up like they said he would. He had mocked God at the beginning, saying their God could not protect them from this judgment, but now he realized that God can protect him. Now, there is no other God that can save like their God. Nebuchadnezzar blesses the one true God. He was right the first time. He was the Son of God that saved them. Nebuchadnezzar's recognition of God of the three men does not mean that he converted to their religion.
Well, he was in pretty deep, with serving all these other gods. I don't think that it would have been a quick change.
It was he's not going to change overnight. God can change him as God begins to work on his spirit and show him, reveal himself to him. But the problem was, the reality here is that Nebuchadnezzar is not going to change. He's going to recognize God as Jehovah, but he's not going to change and serve him only when he's got all these other gods that he believes has been on his side too.
Well, and I think he must be pretty much well versed in all these other gods, because he states that there is no God that can save like this God.
Yep.
So he's got some experience.
He recognizes him being, I think, a God above all gods, but he doesn't recognize him as being the only God. And the sad thing is the fact that Nebuchadnezzar does not say that he is the only God. if we're going to serve God, we've got to recognize him as being the only God. He is not one of many. He's not one and shares a seat with others. He is the only one on the throne of this world, and he will remain on the throne. He's not going to be overthrown by someone. He's not going to be warred out of the throne and defeated. He is Jehovah, and there is no other. So
we've got these boys who have stood up for what they believed in,
yeah,
thrown into the fiery furnace, walk out, and then they get promoted.
they were blessed for standing up for what they believed in. Yep.
I think that hopefully was it the Chaldeans that had
Yep.
brought it up? Maybe they learned their lesson that
They get thrown in the fiery furnace.
they might have
Yeah.
for bringing it up. But the one thing that they challenged was their position and not obeying the king's decree. And then now we're in a situation where they're being promoted.
As a result,
Yeah.
because now Nebuchadnezzar knows that this God they serve, it's not a God to be played with. And I think he is wise in the fact that even though he doesn't recognize him as the only God, he's smart enough to know that he better watch his P's and Q's, because this God was serious about the people that served him.
So I think that we just need to, no matter what we're going through, just remain faithful and consistent and
And
trust
even though
God.
we're going through troubles
Yeah.
and trials and fires and floods, pandemics and the like, God is still looking for his people to remain faithful,
Yeah.
because there's a purpose to play in all things that we deal with. So,
Yeah. That's one thing we need to be found faithful.
found faithful.
Found
That's the main
faithful.
thing. Anything else you want to add there?
I think
Tonight?
this was good, and I'm looking forward to the next chapter in Daniel and finding out more.
Okay, chapter 4 next week.
Yeah.
All right, so listen, guys and gals, girls and boys, it was good having you tonight. Thank you for joining us live there in the recorded set as well.
Yep.
Thank you for joining us each and every service.
Yep.
Remember, pray for May 31st.
And Sunday morning at 10 a.m.
Sunday morning at 10 a.m.
Be here
live.
online.
We'll be singing, praising, worshiping, preaching the word.
Some are
having a great
gathering to
time.
sit in the parking lot, so you're more than welcome
Please
to
know you're welcome.
join the parking
Yeah.
lot crowd.
Those of us that are doing the ministry work and
Our
singing
staff.
or in here doing that and doing the best we can to abide by our guidelines.
Yeah, and we're all looking forward to seeing you soon.
Yep. God bless. Have a wonderful evening.
Good night.